So then, what is actually needed when we want to do a podcast? Well, we need some kind of plan. What we are actually doing. Well, we know we are doing podcast, but we look more into deeply into these topics that I'm now presenting in this slide. But you need some kind of plan when we are starting. And of course, when you are doing audio podcast, you need some kind of recorder or a computer with an external microphone to record or capture the audio. You need some kind of sound editing software on your computer to do some basic thing like turn the file into MP3. Of course, if you're using an external recorder, sometimes that records straight to MP3. And if you record straight to the computer with use an external microphone, then that's, I think, a sound editing software that you are using when you are recording it. But we need to add like an ID tags to the MP3 file. That helps a lot. So you need basic sound editing software. And there's a free ones like an Audacity that you can actually use. But we look more deeply into this also. Then we need actually a place to put the audio file. When you are recording this audio file, that have to be somewhere in the internet that people can actually download it. We need the RSS feed because we are making podcast. There's the file and then there's the RSS feed that tells where the files are. This is not like a very necessary, but like in iTunes and stuff like that, you need some kind of cover art for your podcast. And if you like to have some kind of intro or outro music for your episode, so some kind of music when you start the show and some music when you end the show, well, you need some intro or outro music or other effects if you are using inside your podcast. So let's start with planning. I think whatever you are doing, you need to do some kind of planning, and you need the purpose of doing something. So that's the first thing that you have in the planning. So if you, and I put the target group there as well, and I think if you're making a commercial podcast or a corporate podcast, then you need to think about the target group. If that's like an internal podcast, then well, the employees is the target group. If you are making a podcast, the current customers, then they are the target group. Or if you are just focusing on the current customers and the CEOs, well, then the CEOs are the target group. But if you are making your own podcast in your spare time, sometimes the purpose is just, well, I want to make a podcast. And I think that's well enough purpose. You don't need the target group when you want to do something. That's a hobby. But when you have the purpose of the target group, the one thing that comes to mind is what are you actually going to talk about? If you're not making a music podcast, then it's mainly music. But if you are speaking like I am right now, then you need to think about what I'm actually going to talk about. And where do I get the topics? So if I have like a target group, where do I actually get the topics for the next podcast and the next podcast? So sometimes it helps to have some kind of publishing schedule, mainly to think if you are going to do a weekly podcast or monthly podcast. And sometimes when you're making commercial or corporate podcast, you can actually make the titles or the themes for those podcasts beforehand, and that helps a lot. Then you need to think what kind of or what type of podcast you're making. Is there only going to be one speaker? Is it going to be interviews? Maybe customer interviews or some expertise coming to that show to tell something? Or is it always like panelists that are talking about like 2 to 4 people like around the table kind of thing, because that then when you are thinking about what kind of gear you need, like what kind of microphone and stuff like that, that always relates to this question. Now, of course, you need you need the name of the podcast when you are making. It feels stupid, but yeah, if you're making something, you need the title of the podcast. So that's something good to think of, and sometimes that's a key thing, because that's if you're looking like an podcast category and try to see what kind of podcast they are. The name of the podcast is presented very larger on those lists. So make a good name that could actually help people to actually listen to that podcast.